The talk today is loosely based on the exhibition that was held at the Queen's Gallery, Buckingham Palace. I think it was 2019, George IV Art and Spectacle. But what I thought I'd do is start with some fun, the satirical prints which were in the exhibition, followed by a more serious look at the palaces associated with George IV. And then finally, a small part of the art that he collected. So this is George IV by Thomas Lawrence, a year after he'd become king. He was known in polite society as the first gentleman of Europe because of his style and manners. Although, I mean, I'll say more about his personality in a minute. It's very mixed, but he was bright, he was knowledgeable, but he was also very lazy and a glutton. In other words, he sort of squandered his talents. He was known as Prinny by the populace. I assume an affectionate abbreviation of Prince. And he became, well, he was Prince of Wales, but he became Prince Regent in 1811 when his father, George III, became incapable of governing. And I mention that now because, of course, that gives rise to the art and style of the Regency period. It was a lot of change. It was the time when wigs disappeared. Men stopped wearing wigs, and he introduced darker clothes. Some say it was to hide his bulk, but we're still wearing darker clothes. He, as I said, had a mixed character. Let me read out a description from, this is a quote from the Duke of Wellington. "The worst man he ever fell in with his whole life, the most selfish, the most false, the most ill-natured, the most entirely without one redeeming quality." Although later he said that George was a magnificent patron of the arts, the most extraordinary compound of talent, wit, buffoonery, obstinacy, and good feeling. So I don't know whether that helps. On his death, the Times wrote in the obituary, "Never was an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures than this deceased king. What eye has wept for him? If ever he had a friend, a devoted friend in any rank, we protest that the name of him or her never reached us." So he started with the affections of the country, but it didn't really end that way. So let's see how the satirists viewed him. This and these satirical prints are roughly in chronological order. This, notice in his hand, is called the Golden Apple or the Modern Paris, referring to Paris of Troy. Now, that this is the myth of Paris of Troy was that Zeus, the king of the gods, asked Paris of Troy to give a golden apple to the most beautiful of three goddesses, his wife Hera, or Athena, or Aphrodite. And in this case, the Prince of Wales is giving the golden apple to the Duchess of Rutland, rather than the next woman along, the Duchess of Devonshire or the Duchess of Gordon. None of these were, although George had many mistresses, none of these was George's mistress, but it was prints like these that drove rumours. There were many rumours about who his latest mistress was. And interestingly, George himself was flattered by these cartoons rather than offended. He was born in St. James's Palace. He was the first child of George and the first son of George III, and so became Prince of Wales. He was talented as a boy. He quickly learnt to read and write and speak French, German, and Italian. But when he was 18, he was given more freedom. And unlike his father, George III, was very down to earth, completely scandal-free, reliable. unlike him, as soon as he was given his freedom, he threw himself into a life of dissipation and extravagance, heavy drinking, mistresses, and escapades. He was witty, whether drunk or sober, and he spent money like water. When he was 21, he was awarded an annual income salary by the government of, in today's money, over £13 million. That's over $17 million. But this was far too little, far too little for his excessive expenditure. His stables alone cost a third of that income. Now, his expenditure led to animosity with his father, and they actually didn't agree on hardly anything. They disagreed on most things, politics in particular. The king favoured the conservative politicians. George favoured George IV to be favoured radical politicians like Charles Fox. This is a little bit later, 1789, by George Townley Stubbs, His Highness in Fits. Incidentally, George Townley Stubbs is not the horse artist, George Stubbs, it's his son. But coming back to the Regent, when he was 21, he became infatuated with this, the woman referenced here, Maria Fitzherbert. She was 6 years older than him, twice widowed, and a Roman Catholic, which was disastrous. If he was to marry her, and he was determined to marry her, then this would have barred him from becoming king. Now, they went through a marriage ceremony, but by law, the king had to consent to any marriage, and without the king's consent, the marriage was null and void. So this led to confusion. Maria Fitzherbert believed she was married to him, but she agreed to keep it secret. But the secret got out, but the view was that he wasn't married. And this shows George, who's, although it does look a bit womanly, George is the one on the top, and Miss Fitzherbert embracing on a bed. Look at the garters. Her garter is inscribed Maliponce and his soir, and this is the motto of the Order of the Garter, which in full is Honi soit qui maliponce, which loosely translated means shame on anyone who thinks evil of it. And what Stubbs has done is he's separated it so that his garter reads shame and her garter reads thinks evil, which is clever. I talked about his expenditure. He descended even further into debt. He continually descended further into debt. His father refused to bail him out. He was forced to move in with Fitzherbert, but his friends in government agreed to pay his £21 million. This is in today's money. I'll be using today's money because I think it's easier to relate to. £21 million debt, and granted him an extra £8 million. But he had to declare he wasn't married in order to squash the rumours, which would have caused a public outcry. As I said, the marriage was leaking. So he declared he wasn't married because he knew it by law it wasn't a valid marriage. And it's typical of him, say whatever needs to be said to get things done. This is James Gilray, perhaps the most famous of the caricaturists of the period, illustrating George's uncontrolled self-indulgence in this one. He's now 30. He's sprawling in his chair, picking his teeth with a meat fork. And behind him, you could see on the right, there's an overflowing chamber pot at his elbow, which is having all of his unpaid bills. He had numerous illnesses because of his overeating, And on the right, there are pills and potions, which is difficult to read, but they're labeled stinking breath, piles, venereal disease, and poor digestion. On the wall is a suggestion. It shows Luigi Carnaro, who was a Venetian nobleman whose life was saved. He saved his life by going on a strict diet, and he's drinking, I think, a glass of water there. But George was having none of that. The 4 years before this was produced, his father, George III's mental health deteriorated quickly to such an extent that he couldn't open Parliament, which left the whole country in a bind, because the convention meant that if the king didn't open Parliament, Parliament couldn't proceed with its business. So there wasn't any mechanism for appointing a regent. So he couldn't be appointed regent, and things sort of went on from day to day and month to month, and they eventually passed a regency bill to avoid that happening again. But the king recovered. The prince's, in the meantime, the prince's debt mounted again. The king refused to pay again, but then the king came up with a suggestion that if George agreed to marry Princess Caroline of Brunswick, then he would pay off the bills. So, typical George IV, he did marry her in 1795. And the marriage, of course, was a disaster. They did have one child, Princess Charlotte, but George remained attached to Fitzherbert for the rest of his life, in fact. Although he had other mistresses, and it's said he fathered several illegitimate children. By 1795, the year he married, his debt amounted to an astonishing 66 million in today's money, $90 million equivalent. Parliament increased his grant again by another 7 million, and later by another 5.6 million in today's money. But his debts continued to mount. They were paid off occasionally, but they just grew and grew. And this is a good, we've moved on a while to 1816. Gent, no gent, regent or regent. 22 years later, after that first episode where George III couldn't open Parliament, his mental health broke down again. And this time, the prince became regent shortly after. But the Prince Regent, George, had no interest in government affairs or politics, really. He had no interest in detail. And the convention developed that the Prime Minister was the key person that was supported by a majority of the House and would run Parliament without referring to the King. So if you like, the modern type of Parliament developed because of the, I was going to say failure, maybe that's the wrong word, the disinterest of the Prince Regent. And we see the progression here. Now on the left, George is Prinny, the handsome young officer in the Light Dragoons. In the middle, he's become a drunken sot, sitting on Miss Fitzherbert's lap, by the way, surrounded by his cronies. On the right, he sits grossly fat, which he was by this stage, supported by crutches, enormous gouty legs. Isabella, Marchioness of Hertford, who was his mistress at that time, is on the left, offering him a glass of punch, and John McMahon, who was an MP, and his private secretary, is on the right, always shown in caricatures as a tiny little person. You'll notice his eyes, the regent's eyes, are turned on his mistress's large breasts. On his head is a Chinese headdress, and above him a green dragon, which is taken from the green dragon above the chandelier in Brighton Pavilion. And it's making fun of his interest in Chinese taste. A lot of the cartoons and caricatures made fun of that. This shows a royal reception given by Queen Caroline at the Queen's House, as it was called at this time, now Buckingham Palace. And Cruikshank, George Cruikshank, it was described at the time as the modern Hogarth, is making fun of these soirees, these parties, showing the absurd fashions. It was believed that too many people were allowed to attend. It wasn't just the right sort. They became crowded, and a contemporary described it that the crowds are so great and so little decorum attended to that people's clothes are literally torn to pieces. And we can see that on the left of the picture here, this woman's dress being accidentally torn by this chap who's standing on her train. In the doorway, an obese man and woman have collided and jammed themselves in the doorway. And she, you can see here, is standing on his gouty foot. On the left, sorry, on the right here, an officer is driving his sabre into a much distressed lady. And on the floor, there's fans, a shoe buckle, a bag from a wig. It's just making fun of the inconvenience of a crowded drawing room. This is a bit more serious because it was, well, it's entitled How to Get Unmarried, there's the rub, 1820. Remember, 1820 is when the Prince Regent, George III, died, and the Prince Regent became the King George IV. And as soon as he became George IV, he attempted to dissolve the marriage to Caroline without her permission, without her agreement. There were, just going back a bit, in 1806, there were rumours that Caroline had had an illegitimate child, and an inquiry, a government inquiry was set up, but they found it was just rumours. There was no foundation to the rumour. But in 1814, she did move to Italy, and it was rumoured, and I think it's clear today, that she did have an affair with her servant, Bartolomeo Pergami. It was in 1806, though, when this ill-founded rumour started that that George stopped allowing her access to her daughter Charlotte, who was 10 at the time. So from that point on, she wasn't allowed to see her. Meanwhile, Charlotte, incidentally, had become the people's princess, loved by the nation, and she married, and they moved to Claremont and lived a happy and quiet life until she died in childbirth when she was just 21 and mourned by the whole nation. Caroline, her mother, was devastated. She was living in Italy and only found out about it. George refused to tell her. She only found out about it from a messenger who was passing through the place where she lived. So coming back to what's going on here, as I said, he attempted to divorce her. She was very popular with the public, and so it provoked a host of caricatures like this one. The king and queen, the king and queen are tied by the matrimonial knot. On the left is Justice, blind Justice, and the Queen's lawyer, a brilliant young Whig lawyer called Henry Broome. That's his name there, Henry Broome. And on the right, there's, well, starting at this end, there's Lord Sidmouth, I think it is, the Home Secretary, tugging at Lady Conyngham, the King's last mistress. and her arms around Castlereagh, the Foreign Secretary, and his arms are pulling. So they're all trying to pull the king away, but without success. So he couldn't divorce her. But what he did do is bar her from his coronation, and she died 3 weeks later. She claimed that she'd been poisoned, but no evidence was found for that. Incidentally, when she died, Lord Liverpool decided that because of the crowds, the mob that was waiting for her funeral to pass, he moved the funeral to another part of the city to avoid the crowds. But they found out the crowds were incensed, and a riot broke out. The guard was called, they drew their sabres, and in the end 2 people were shot in the crowd. So 2 people were killed. And then finally, to finish off this series of caricatures, and of course there were many at the time, it's showing George in 1829, this is the year before he died, as an obese man in Chinese dress, still making fun of his love of Chinese things, sitting on a large teapot called Treasury Teapot, smoking, holding a pet giraffe. The pipe he's smoking is in the letter C, and in the smoke it says, "Oh, 'tis love, 'tis love, 'tis love." Out of the teapot comes Chinese coins, and someone is collecting those in order to fund what his toys. They're presented here as little models, but the one down here, this one, is Buckingham Palace. The one behind him up here is Brighton Pavilion. And all up here it's called lots of churches, it says here. But, and you might wonder why it says there's a fish up here and a fishing rod, and it says caught in Virginia water. That's because the king had spent most of his time at Windsor fishing in Virginia water. And or near Virginia water, in the grounds of Windsor Castle, there was a menagerie, and the king was given a Nubian giraffe as a diplomatic gift from Egypt a couple of years before this, 2 years before. And the animal actually died in 1829, the year this cartoon was produced. And George IV had it stuffed. And so the giraffe from 1827 onwards was a common symbol used by satirists to condemn his extravagance and frivolous lifestyle, which is what this cartoon is all about. Or by this date, he was so obese that and so ill for many reasons, that he was taking laudanum for the pain, and it said he'd become addicted to laudanum. And that's one of the reasons, his obesity and his addiction was one of the reasons he was secluded in Windsor Castle. He occasionally interfered in politics. For example, he denounced the Catholic Emancipation Bill, although it was finally approved this same year. But by and large, he wasn't involved in politics and hardly left Windsor Castle. He was suffering from gout, arteriosclerosis, dropsy, and possibly porphyria, the same illness as his father is believed to have suffered from. And he spent days in bed. His weight meant he could hardly breathe. And one aide, this is a quote, an aide wrote, "A more contemptible, cowardly, selfish, unfeeling dog does not exist. There have been good and wise kings, but not many of them, and this I believe to be one of the worst." And that was from one of the aides supporting him. By 1828, the year before, he was almost completely blind, and gout in his arms as well as his legs meant he couldn't sign documents, which was necessary at the time to pass laws. And he had to sleep upright in a chair. He was still eating vast quantities of food. And it's, I've got an idea here, a measure here. For breakfast, 3 parts of a bottle of Moselle, a glass of dry champagne, 2 glasses of port, and a glass of brandy for breakfast. And he died on the morning of the 26th of June, 1830, of internal bleeding because of a ruptured blood vessel in his stomach, which was so distended. Let's look at the sort of official paintings, though, rather than the caricatures. I'll just show you 2 of them. I thought it would balance up the sort of official view of him with the everyday view. This painting by Thomas Phillips emphasizes the decorum and international prestige of George IV. It's shown, this is in Petworth, and what's happening is he's presenting the Earl of Egremont to the Tsar Alexander I of Russia and the King of Prussia. The paintings on the wall are Fox and Pitt, and they were never on the wall at Petworth. So I think they were added by the artist for symbolic reasons to sort of all the good and the great are there. And it's celebrating in 1814 the Peace of Paris. So the Allied sovereigns all visited England. That's what's going on here. And so it's showing George IV, who at that time was Prince Regent, brokering, if you like, this meeting of the great and the good. Although it was written that even then, at this time, the visitors were dismayed by his drunken behavior. Another history painting by the history painter in England, Benjamin Hayden. This was painted 25 years after the battle. It's meant to be the Duke of Wellington describing the field of Waterloo to His Majesty George IV. It was painted after George had died. It was painted in 1840, and it was sort of honouring the Battle of Waterloo. This event, I don't think, this event of George on horseback being shown the scene of the battle never took place. But it's Hayden here presenting a sort of a mythical historical event. Unfortunately for Hayden, the English state never supported history paintings, as happened in France. In France, these powerful militaristic images were paid for by the state, but the English never had an appetite for this grand manner propaganda that sort of directly or indirectly celebrated the glories of war, which meant that history painters like Benjamin Hayden couldn't really sell their work. And he, as I think I've told you before, he got into debt. He regarded the nation and the public as ungrateful, and he committed suicide in the end, leaving a note that said, "Stretch me no longer on this rough world." Even his suicide didn't go to plan. He shot himself, but the shot didn't kill him, so he cut his own throat. A sad story, Benjamin Hayden. Oh, just on another sort of angle on this, when the news of the victory at Waterloo arrived in London, it arrived by messenger. One of the soldiers from one of the soldiers from the battlefield arrived in London and interrupted the Prince Regent at a party. He was attending a party, and the hostess of the party complained about the interruption for years afterwards, and the Prince Regent sent her a gold eagle by way of apology for interrupting her party. Over 40,000 soldiers died at Waterloo. But let me talk about his buildings briefly before talking about his artwork. There are four main buildings, and four I'm going to talk about. There's Carlton House, no longer exists, demolished in 1826. There's the Brighton Pavilion, of course. There's Buckingham Palace, and there's Windsor Castle. So let's go through them. Carlton House. This is the dining room at Carlton House, very different from what you might be thinking of as the sparse sort of bare Regency style you might think of when you think of Jane Austen. George's style was lavish and covered in gold. Everything, his interiors were wall-to-wall gold. And Carlton House was one of his first forays into architecture. And just to explain where it was, if you go down the Mall, or Pall Mall, and turn left between the Institute of Directors and the Athenaeum, you go through, there's a sort of a park on your right, and then you come to some steps that go down to the Mall, and there's St. James's Park opposite. Well, just before you go down those steps, that area there is where Carlton House was built, and the steps are relevant because part of the house, Carlton House, was built on that slope, and the foundations weren't sturdy enough, and because of that, the building started to need repair, but the repairs became so bad that it was actually demolished, as I said, in 1826. It was decided it couldn't be salvaged, and it just survives. There's now a column there in the centre of those steps, but the part of Carlton House still remains. Some of you might know this. You recognise that? I'm sure you do. It's the National Gallery. The portico of Carlton House was moved to become the portico of the National Gallery. Well, the cost of Carlton House was part of George's enormous debts. And when the creditors threatened to repossess all the furniture of Carlton House, and George shut up the house and moved to Brighton. And then a few years later, it started to collapse and was demolished. So Brighton next. This is where he moved to, relatively modest house overlooking the sea, but he immediately started to extend it, excuse me, using the architect Henry Holland. And he lived in the house with his mistress, Maria Fitzherbert. And Brighton was, but then even more, became the centre of fashionable society. Partly because the waters of Brighton were thought to be restorative. It was a place to visit for the waters, and there was also horse racing at Brighton. But this house, even extended, wasn't enough for him. So he employed John Nash to work to create Brighton Pavilion. He first of all bought these stables. This is an extended version of the original stables he bought. He then extended it further and turned it into this sort of Oriental fantasy, sometimes called Indian Gothic, but it's a mixture of Indian, Chinese, and even French architecture. And the interior decoration was spectacular. This is the dining room, and I showing this partly to refer back to that dragon. Remember, we saw a dragon above his head. The caricaturist was referring to this dragon up here supporting the chandelier and making fun of it. It was all seen to be over the top and to excess. And this is the Royal Pavilion at Brighton today. Now, when George IV died, William IV became king and started to finish off and extend some of these places. Victoria became queen in 1837, but she decided not to use the pavilion, but instead she used Osborne House as the royal seaside retreat. And so Brighton Pavilion was sort of closed up and wasn't used. And she sold the pavilion to the city of Brighton in 1850. And it's remained owned by the council ever since. Although I should say that a couple of years ago, in 2020, the Brighton transferred ownership to a new charity, along with their other museums like the Hove Museum and the Brighton Museum, in order to share staff and basically to reduce costs. And it's not clear how that cost reduction program is going, particularly with the impact of COVID and the lack of visitors. And so I'm not sure what the future of the building is going to be. Right, this is a Buckingham House way back in 1703. And this area, the area which is now occupied by Buckingham Palace, was originally a marsh. It was fed by the River Tyburn, which still flows underneath the palace, even today. After the Norman conquest, it became owned by the monk. In fact, it was given to one of the knights by William the Conqueror, and then the knight transferred ownership to the monks of Westminster Abbey. And it's Westminster Abbey that you can see in the distance. In other words, we're looking at this Buckingham House from the north, looking towards the south, and so behind it you see Westminster Abbey. It's before Westminster Abbey had the two towers built by Nicholas Hawksmoor, which was in 1722 to onwards. The towers were being built. In Henry VII later took the lands from the Abbey, and later still James I, so it was then owned by the monarch, James I established a 4-acre mulberry garden to make silk. He actually bought the wrong sort of mulberry. He bought black mulberry and he should have bought white. So it didn't make very good silk, but in roughly where we're standing in this picture, it was the mulberry garden. It was in the northwest of the Buckingham Palace gardens as it is now. It was actually an area that was well known at the time, notorious for male prostitutes. One document called it an area for sodoms and spintries at the Mulberry Garden at St. James's. So it's possible that Buckingham Palace was once a gay brothel, you'll be pleased to hear. A house was erected in 1624 known as Goring House, and through a legal omission, and it was partly because of the interregnum, that the right documents were never signed, and so George, the monarchs, and George III retained the freehold of the house. The house was burnt down and rebuilt, and then coming on in 1703, the first Duke of Buckingham and Normanby built Buckingham House, as you see here. It was sold by his son to George III for £21,000 as a retreat for his wife, Queen Charlotte, and so it was known as the Queen's House. And the structure was remodeled from about 1791 and became known as Buckingham Palace. And George IV started to extend the property from when he became king in 1820. And in 1826, he employed John Nash to create a grand palace. This is, interestingly, it was painted, this is a painting of that palace, east front from St. James's Park, by Joseph Nash. And I had to check this, but as far as I can tell, Joseph Nash, who studied with Augustus Pugin, was not related to John Nash, the architect. I guess it's a common name. He was a watercolor painter. Now, John Nash and George IV conceived a grand plan. It started in Regent's Park. It involved building a street we now call Regent Street, down to St. James's Palace, past the palace, over into St. James's Park, and along to Buckingham Palace. One grand metropolitan scheme, all linked together. And as part of that, at the end of that, George transformed Buckingham House into this U-shaped palace in the 1820s. Partly, he was trying to create a grand rival to Versailles. And at the front, there's a large arch representing his victories at Napoleon, and you might recognize it, it's Marble Arch. It was transferred to where it's now situated later. The cost was enormous. It got completely out of control, like most costs associated with George. It approached $500,000 in money then. Nash was sacked. George never moved in, and it was William IV who finished this. And it almost became essentially the Palace of Westminster, the Houses of Parliament, because the Houses of Parliament burnt down, and there was talk of moving to this building. It was taken over by Victoria. She found the palace was too small, and in fact, she sold Brighton Pavilion for $35,000 in order to fund the restoration of this building. And there was a new wing built across the front to enclose the central courtyard by Victoria, which is more or less the end. These were filled in as well to give you the palace as it looks today. So George's thoughts turned to improving Windsor Castle as well. This was in 1823 when he was king. He drew up plans, and Parliament in this case voted him $150,000 for the work. But by 1830, when he died, costs were over $800,000. Again, they're completely out of control. And but it was the work was finished, and it created the castle we know today. It was home to the monarch from William the Conqueror's time. William Conqueror, in fact, built the original castle in the 11th century. And George, rather than being innovative, well, he was innovative internally, but externally, he wanted to restore the Gothic elements. And so what he did is he raised the height of the grand central tower to create the skyline we see today, which is, this is today's skyline. And he raised the height of the central tower and created the green and crimson drawing rooms where some of his art collection is on show and can be seen today. So let's talk about the art collection. From the time he was, well, in fact, before he was king, but certainly from the time he was king, when he had access to more money, he bought everything: paintings, metalwork, textiles, furniture, furnishings, watercolors, books, ceramics, you name it, in vast numbers. And the finest artists of the day and the finest artists throughout history, particularly Dutch and Flemish masterpieces, but also portraits by Sir Thomas Lawrence, Sir Joshua Reynolds, and so on, and by Rembrandt. So the first one I wanted to show you was in fact the most expensive painting that he purchased for 5,000 guineas in 1811 when he was still regent. He was an avid art collector, but also a very skilled art connoisseur. This is the shipbuilder and his wife, perhaps the most famous of his acquisitions, painted in 16, getting my dates muddled, in 1633, when Rembrandt was a successful and fashionable portrait painter. And it's a very unusual, well, in fact, I think unique for a portrait at that time, or in other words, Rembrandt had created this idea of showing the husband and the wife in the same painting. Normally they were separate portraits, and he's combined them in one, but also he's shown a sort of dynamic interaction. The wife has burst into the room with a note interrupting her husband. I don't know whether that was something she did regularly. He's in the middle, he's a shipbuilder, so he's in the middle of drawing up plans for a ship. You can see the compasses are still in his hand, and he's looking around with a sort of I don't know what you'd call it, a quizzical, but not happy expression. So he's caught that there's some amusing, I guess, aspects to this, obviously approved of by the people who paid for this portrait. He was at the height of his powers at this stage, Rembrandt. Another painting by Rembrandt, Agatha Bass, arguably, in my view, one of the most beautiful portraits in the royal collection, painted a bit later, 1641. And it was 3 years after their marriage, and they lived in, Agatha Bass's marriage, and she lived in the same street as Rembrandt. And it was at this stage, well, in fact, a few years before, that Rembrandt and his wife Saskia had moved to a new house. As I said, he was very popular, was making a load of money, and he moved to a new house in the fashionable New Dolenstraat. And he should have been able to afford the mortgage, but I think the problem was he always spent as much as he earned as soon as he earned it. And I think it was the mortgage that led to his later financial downfall, because he had to keep repaying the mortgage, and his, for various reasons, his income dropped and he couldn't afford the upkeep. There's a companion to this in in Brussels, her husband, Nicholas Bambeck. And in this, these portraits, Rembrandt has introduced another new element. The ebony frame blurs the distinction between the painted scene and the real world. Notice how he's added to the illusion by having her hand come over the edge of the frame the painted frame in the picture. Incidentally, this picture has been cut down slightly. Originally, the frame was larger, so the effect was stronger. And also her fan goes over the edge of the frame, as does his sleeve, his glove, and his hand going over the edge of the frame, blurring, as I said, the distinction between the painted and the real world. The technical mastery is, needless to say, I think, extraordinary. He used all sorts of techniques. He used the end of his brush just to incise the very fine hairs that were falling over the forehead. The lace is painted in two different ways. In some areas, he painted a thick white pigment over the dark background, and in others, he painted the white pigment over the dark background, and in other areas he painted the black over the white to create the lace. There are 5 paintings by Rembrandt in the Royal Collection. So we have these thanks to George IV. He bought this painting by Rubens in 1818, when he was still regent, thinking it was a portrait of Helena Forment, who was Rubens' second wife, but later research has found she doesn't look like portraits of Helena Forment, and some believe it's a picture of her sister Elizabeth. I think she had something like 8 or 9 siblings. He married her in 1630, 4 years, I should say, after his previous wife, Isabella Brandt, died. She was the youngest child of Danielle Forment, who was a friend of Rubens and a wealthy Antwerp silk and tapestry merchant. He was also related to Isabella Brandt in that her father, Danielle Forment, married the sister of Isabella Brandt. On the left is a portrait of Susanna London, often called the Straw Hat. Now in the National Gallery, you might recognize it. And Susanna London, who had recently married Arnold London, her maiden name was Forment. She was a sister of Helena Forment. This painting, one on the left, the Straw Hat, was also offered to George IV. Interestingly, it's the only work he's ever known to have refused on the grounds of cost. We don't know how much he was asked to pay for it, but he turned it down. I think the sort of intimate, informal and engaging charm they both have is consistent with them both being members of Rubens' extended family, whether it's his wife, which we think it isn't, or his wife's sister on the right. Another Rubens, landscape with St. George and the Dragon. Well, from 1629 to 1630, Rubens lived in England, and he painted this when he got back to Antwerp. He said, in honor of England. Now, we know he stayed with Balthazar Gerbier at York House, and Gerbier was his patron, was the Duke of Buckingham, who owned York House, but he died. He was stabbed and died in 1628, the year before. And in fact, his executors tried to throw Gerbier out as an alien, but to stop them, he became an English citizen. He became naturalized to stop them throwing him out. So when Rubens arrived a year later, he was probably, we don't know for certain, but we think he's probably still hanging on, living there. And we think that, well, we know that Rubens lived in the house, and so he probably had a room overlooking the Thames. The York House is on the north bank, so overlooking the south bank of the Thames. So there's been lots of speculation about what these buildings might be, and I've selected what I think is the most likely. The church and the tower over here, I think, could be St. Mary Overy, which we now call Southwark Cathedral. This building, I think, is the banqueting house, which you're going to tell me isn't near Southwark Cathedral, I know, but I think what he did is he moved it. So he knew the banqueting house and has painted it the other side of the river to create the scene. And I think the building down here, there's been a lot of speculation about what that might be. My guess is that it's Lambeth Palace. Now, some say that the St. George here has the features of Charles I, and the princess that he's rescuing features of Queen Henrietta Maria. I'm not sure from portraits I've seen that that's Henrietta Maria, but it does look a bit like Charles I. This picture was bought a few years later by Charles I's ambassador, Endymion Porter, and it's now in the Royal Collection. The original painting, incidentally, was this sort of size, roughly, and Rubens extended the canvas with 8 further rectangles to create the picture we see today. It was actually sold during the Commonwealth sale during the interregnum, when all the royal goods were sold off, and repurchased by George IV in 1814. So that's why I'm showing you as a purchase of George IV. It was in the Royal Collection. It's now in the Royal Collection, but it was sold during the interregnum and bought back. Triple portrait of Charles I by Van Dyck, chief assistant to Rubens. It was painted, we know, as a guide for Lorenzo Bernini in 1637, as he was commissioned to produce a portrait bust in marble, but didn't want to visit England. And the portrait bust was bought by, this triple portrait was bought by George IV, and for 1,000 guineas. It was, the bust was, on which this was based, was presented to the King Charles I at Oatlands Palace in 1637, and it was very well received. The Bernini was given a diamond ring worth £800. They said, and this is a quote, "Not only for the exquisiteness of the work, but the likeness and near resemblance it had to the king's countenance." Unfortunately, the bust was destroyed by the Whitehall fire of 1698. There are many portraits of Charles I, and many by Van Dyck, but this is one of the few triple portraits, and we think it was inspired by this triple portrait 100 years before by Lorenzo Lotto. And partly we say that because we know it was bought by Charles I in 1627. So that was before Van Dyck had arrived. So I'm sure he must have seen this triple portrait by Lotto. And it's likely, by the way, that this in turn, the Lotto portrait, was inspired by Leonardo da Vinci's triple portrait of Cesare Borgia, now lost. Well, George IV decided that he would make a collection of works of British artists, and he paid Edward Bird, who was a well-known genre painter, 250 guineas for this work when he was still regent. He was advised by Benjamin West. It's painted in the style of Dutch painting, which George IV liked. It shows ordinary country folk, like the work of David Teniers, the younger, who George IV admired, and we're going to see next. What we see here, I like the young child, no doubt has been crying. He's being carried out by his mother as someone holds the door open for them, as if to get them to go out as quickly as possible. The verger here is rehearsing a choir and musicians for the Sunday service to be held in a church you can see outside the window here. It shows the God-fearing decency of the English working men and women. And this would be a comfort, because at this time we'd been at war with France on and off for 17 years with the revolutionary atheist republic. This is the Teniers. It's an unusually large painting by Teniers, and it's one of his earliest works. It shows a pub yard. We know it's a pub, well, because they're drinking, but also there's a pub sign here, a crescent moon, and above it a beer pot. There's a man here playing the bagpipes, and there's 3 couples dancing. There's a lot of cheerfulness going on, a lot of drinking, a lot of talking, some love making, although it looks to me as though this woman is, from the look of her face, doesn't have anything to do with him. He's pushing him away by the looks of it. And this man over here is vomiting. So everything going on in the pictures, man over here fishing, but the center or the foreground of the painting is, I think, the interesting part. The painting is making fun of the clumsy dancing and the cheerful coarseness of the peasants, but there's some class-based humor. This group over here are much more wealthy, and this horrified middle-class young lady is being invited to dance by this laughing rustic here. So that's something that would further amuse people. William Mulready, The Wolf and the Lamb. So what's this about? A boy on his way to school with his little dog has been set upon, he's being bullied by another boy, and a little girl is calling for help from her mother. The interesting thing, I think, is The Wolf and the Lamb, the title. It was believed at this time that a person's character, you could tell from their facial features, and everyone knew these drawings by Charles Le Brun, the French artist, which are in the Louvre. And this is Wolfman. So the bully, has got a face like a wolf, and the boy a face like a lamb, which indicates, everyone believed, their innate personality. And this is referring to that belief. The Mulready was born in Ireland, but his family moved to London when he was a child, and he was a child prodigy. He went to the Royal Academy School when he was 14 and became a Royal Academician when he was 30. He was a well-known genre painter, but also illustrated children's books. He's maybe best known for designing the postal stationery. When the penny black, the first postage stamp, came in 1840, the Royal Mail released stationery as well. You could buy stationery that went with the stamp, designed by Mulready. Mulready's design wasn't liked, people didn't buy it, and it was actually replaced within 2 months. But he's known for producing that first stationery. And this, of course, Albert Cuyp, An Evening Landscape with Figures and Sheep. Cuyp's an interesting artist. He was born in Dordrecht, and lived and died there. He's often called the Dutch Claude Lorraine, which I think you can see from the picture, but he inherited a considerable fortune, but all of his family were artists. His father was a well-known portrait painter and taught him as he grew up. He painted from the age of 19 to 40, but stopped. And in fact, when he was 40, he married, and it's generally assumed his wife stopped him. And a year later, he became deacon of the local Reformed church. And so that may also be the reason. But you can recognize his paintings from the light. And often the sunlight streaming across his picture picks out details like these blades of grass or these twigs here sort of stand out strongly lit by the sunlight, which he also used to pick out in some paintings, like a cow's horn or the top of a person's hat, the various little dots of light, a bit like a Constable, John Constable used some years later to as dots in the trees to bring them to life. The painting was bought in 1814. It was part of a number of paintings that were bought at the time. The George actually at this time, remember I said he was a connoisseur. He decided to rationalize his collection by selling what he viewed as the lesser works, and today are generally regarded as lesser works, and retained the great works that I've been showing you, and many more. He sold 55 works and acquired some more works with the proceeds. So he upped the quality of his collection, and he bought more works by Rubens, Teniers and Cuyp, and also sold works by them that he didn't view as good. So he wasn't just buying by the name of the artist, he was buying by the quality of the work. And one of the works he bought was Gerrit Douw, a pupil of Rembrandt. And he was born in Leiden, rarely travelled outside Leiden, even though he was invited to England by Charles II. He was much sought after. Maybe I'll say a little bit about him, because he was a student of Rembrandt. Rembrandt at the time, Rembrandt was born in Leiden and at the time hadn't moved to Amsterdam. So he was still in Leiden, his studio was in Leiden, and Gerrit Douw's father apprenticed him to Rembrandt, and he was an apprentice for 3 years. But after that, he starts painting in a different style from Rembrandt, much more detailed, called Leiden Feinschilder, fine art. These small, highly polished paintings are typical of this style. And he also often paints by candlelight or by lantern light. Or I should say not paints by, but paints scenes that are lit that way. So his paintings are often very small. This is about 40 by 30. He started as a portrait painter, but subjects weren't willing to sit for as long as he wanted them to sit. It's said that he spent, on one occasion, 5 days painting one hand. Only some, I don't know whether you regard it as a lot or a little, but some 200 paintings are attributed to him, and they're now in museums all over Europe. He was widely purchased across Europe, and he's very well known. In fact, the Swedish ambassador paid him, I think it was 500 guilders a year, just to have rights of first refusal on any new painting he produced. That didn't buy him any paintings. It was just to have right of first refusal. This is the grocer's shop, and we see the grocer's store behind us, an archway with the two figures interacting. There's a woman buying some things that are being weighed in front of her. And emphasizes the importance of trade to the Dutch. And it was shops like this replaced stalls and street traders at this time. It was the peak and towards the end of the Dutch Golden Age, which I will be talking about as I think it's my last talk this session. This is one of Jan Steen's finest works. And there's so many symbols here. I need to go through them. First of all, the obvious. There's a young woman on a bed with her lapdog putting on, I think she's putting on or taking off a stocking. There's a chamber pot nearby, shoes scattered around, and she's looking directly at us. So I think the first thing to say is that there's an intent of seduction. The viewer, though, is kept out of her room by this classical doorway on which his name, Steen, which means stone, is on the stonework of the left-hand pillar, and the date of the painting, 1663, is on the right-hand pillar. But there's much more to it symbolically. The arch represents moral probity, and this would have been recognized at the time. Above the arch, there's a sunflower, which represents constancy, grapevines, domestic virtue. There's a weeping cherub. All things on the arch saying, do not enter, do not be seduced. Inside, there's a lot of symbols of the shortness of life, what we call vanitas objects. There's a lute with a broken string. You can see the string here broken. This here is a skull with vines intertwined. There's a candle gone out, another sign of vanitas. There's an open jewelry box, another sign at the time of vanitas objects, all signifying the transience of life and misdirected sensual pleasure. In fact, even pulling on the stocking has a message, because in emblem books at the time, pulling on a stocking too quickly could result in a hole. You had to be careful, not impetuous. In other words, the meaning was that being impetuous or indulging in sensuality could lead to ruin. So the meaning of this is that to pass through the arch, which of course no one looking at this picture would dream of doing, because it would risk the loss of virtue. So it's a moral painting pointing out the good morals of the viewer and how the viewer would in no way succumb to such temptation. There are other meanings. There's levels of meanings in this. Just quickly, stockings. The Dutch word for stocking was slang for fornication. The Dutch word for chamber pot, when combined with the word for stocking, was a pejorative word for women. So there's a lot of other levels of meaning in this. Finally, Canova. This is Antonio Canova, Mars and Venus. Venus stands partly draped, gazing up at Mars. And this was commissioned when he was still regent for Carlton House in 1815, when Canova visited London to see the Elgin marbles, and in fact advised Lord Elgin on the marbles, on how they might be renovated. And Canova said to Lord Elgin that even he, and he was the leading, regarded amongst other things as the leading renovator in Europe, he said even he wouldn't touch them because they could be damaged, they shouldn't be touched. And it represents the allegory of war and peace, and it's reminding everyone of England's victory over Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. That's why it was commissioned by Prince Regent the same year. It's still in the Royal Collection. It's at the end of the Marble Hall in Buckingham Palace. So with that, finally, I'll say goodbye to George IV with this rear view of Mars and Venus. I hope you enjoyed this brief tour of the Regency and his reign. He was a flawed character, certainly, but an avid art collector. Thank you.